Slides.
Yeah. Give me a second. Share screen. It's saying host disabled share screen.
So maybe Raphael can enable.
Okay, let me try it again now.
It should work.
Okay, sorry about this.
Hey, we can see it. Okay, so the second speaker today is Harold Kincaid. And well, if you don't know who Harold Kincaid is, then you don't know any philosophy of social science. So, you know, I won't engage in a long presentation except to make him feel very old. Should I say that his book on the philosophical foundations of social science was probably the first book that I read of philosophy of social science when I was in grad school. And yeah, Harold had a big influence on me, at least, you know, in persuading me that I was a naturalist. And today he's going to talk about naturalism and social ontology. So the floor, or whatever the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Yeah, thanks, Francesco. I much enjoyed your work following it over the years, so that's a very nice compliment. Here's an overview of what I'm going to do. I start off by saying this is a work in progress, and there are lots of big issues involved. So my discussion here will no doubt be sketchy at points. Hopefully the paper will be a little less sketchy. Basically, the talk's divided into two sections, section 1 and section B. The first section is a sort of a framework for thinking about meta-ontology applied to the social sciences, and I'm going to sketch sort of a naturalist and then an extension contextualist view. And then the second half of the paper applies this to various issues in social ontology. I'm going to go through some approaches that I think are not so helpful, and then case studies, the longest of which will be individualism and agent-based models. So, you know, naturalism is a broad congregation. Many of its members think other alleged naturalists are centrists. I'm one of those, sort of like Trotskyites. But I want to say that versions of naturalism, like, let's say, science counts, or that metaphysics argues by providing the best explanation of science, or Laurie Paul. I think these versions a bit too weak for me. So I have three main neural naturalist claims that frame my discussion. The first is that there are no special a priori philosophical methods that produce knowledge about the world, sort of anti-foundationalism. Then knowledge about the natural world comes from scientific methods broadly conceived, and social phenomena are part of the natural world and thus approachable by scientific methods, again, broadly conceived. We could talk about what that qualification means. I want to elaborate this with some contextualist ideas, which you might look at Michael Williams. There are all kinds of people who've developed these ideas, not new to me at all. One way to put this is that we're never in the position of evaluating all our knowledge at once, kind of a holism point. So then I think that that means knowledge claims are really arguments made in specific context of background knowledge that we feel fairly confident about. So to me, that means very general claims about how science and social science works are likely to be suspect. Perhaps a moral from that claim is that the philosophical stories about theories, laws, natural kinds, explanation are likely to be too simple. I would argue, and this is not new to me either, that much science involves piecemeal causal explanation and piecemeal applications of concepts. For the latter idea, you should look at Wilson's wonderful stuff on in Wandering Significance and Nancy Cartwright's work. So some further related ideas about social ontology that comes from this framework is that what a theory says, and to what extent there is a theory, has to be looked at case by case. Philosophers of science and even analytic metaphysicians can help if it's done in the spirit of clarification rather than ruling on how the world must be. I think I sort of grew up with Quinean stuff, and I think the meaning of bound variable story is useful, but I think it's really only a first start. What entities a theory or causal story is committed to is a complex and contextual question. And then even if you find out what a theory is committed to, what that exactly entails is another big issue. I think this is illustrated in the quantifier variance literature. There are a bunch of issues there. But one moral from that discussion is that essential reference by a theory can have different ontological applications. So one important version to me of this quantifier variance idea is a certain kind of local instrumentalism, which says that science, especially social science, may have useful posits, but ones that do not have full ontological status. If you want some examples of this, think about Dennett on centers of gravity. The notion of formative latent variables in psychometrics and structural equation modeling, where basically you have a variable, but it's a sum of indicators. So think about depression. Is depression really an independent entity over and above low mood, etc.? Yeah, not so. And then there are all kinds of simplifications and tractability assumptions in the social sciences that are very useful, but you have to ask, what are they committing you to ontologically? Representative agents in economics is a good example. And I think all this has to be investigated case by case. So I'm going to look at some social science applications, starting with some less fruitful approaches to social ontology, and then talk about some better ways forward, which are basically case studies. First one of individualism and agent-based models, then structural realism, and then race. I'll spend the most time in the individualism agent-based model case here in the paper. They'll be in detail in all three. Here are some what I take to be unfruitful anti-naturalist approaches to social ontology. Starting first with John Searle. He's quite explicit that you should first figure out the ontology, and then after we've got that all cleared up, then we can do social science. I quote, social ontology is prior to methodology and theory. I think a naturalist and contextualist approach would argue that we have at least to do both jointly, and that's a fairly wishy-washy claim, but being non-sectarian here, the point is it's quite implausible that you can do social ontology independent of empirical social science. I also think it's a mistake to give common sense concepts priority. And you know, geez, let's look at the natural sciences, and what we see is that common sense concepts can be completely overturned. But in the social sciences, certainly concepts that people have can be a total explanation. To me, much current social ontology by philosophers is pretty much completely divorced from real social science applications. You look at Tomella or Gilbert, etc. It's mostly armchair conceptual analysis. I don't think, nonetheless, that it's impossible conceptual work by philosophers might well help. Witness, for example, the work of Mackey, Gleamore, etc. on causation, which has really made big contributions to empirical social science. And then I think we have to realize that social scientists, like scientists in general, have to do conceptual work all the time. So it's not like that's something that's cannot help. I think the moral is that the further the social ontology is from real social science problems, the more likely it is to be sterile. So let me move to applications of these ideas to social ontology, starting with with individualism and agent-based models. Of course, there's been and continues to be a big debate over methodological individualism among social scientists and philosophers. I think debate frequently been at cross purposes and the claims have been unclear. I think one way to understand the debate, stuff I've argued about or written about too long, really, is over empirical issues about the ontology of the social world. So I think a useful social ontology exercise is to spell out what the empirical possibilities might be for debates over individualism. And so I want to do that in a little detail. It's a non-trivial question, what kind of individualism social scientists are committed to. I think my contextualism suggests that this question is probably too broad to ask about individualism in the social sciences. We need to look at more specific pieces of social research. So I'm going to use agent-based models as a case study, because I have a forthcoming paper on this with Julie Zala. And then the question is, what version, if any, of individualisms are ABMs committed to? So AB-based models are quite widespread across the social sciences, showing an early example, Epstein of, not Brian, but of the books on generative social science are examples. And there are tons of people who claim that ABMs are motivated by an individualist ontology. Here's a long list running right up to the present. So first question we need to ask, if we're going to do social ontology, is just what is an agent-based model? And here's sort of a matrix of what they might involve: a set of individuals, a set of properties of individuals, a set of environmental factors, a set of relations among the members of individuals in the set I, and a set of relations among the elements. And ABMs typically have variables that record aggregate values of any of these parameters. So the way ABMs work is you take a set of elements, you run a summation, parameters updated, the process is repeated. But that's just the process of running the models. The key ontological commitments from the elements I just described. So the issue here, I'm doing sort of like concrete social ontology, is to ask what ABMs are committed to and what kind of individualism might they support. But when we ask what kind of individualism they might support, then we also need to work here to get clear about what that means. And so I think a natural framework is to think of individualism involving a set of humans, their properties, a set of factors in the broad physical environment, a set of relations of members, relations between the members and the set of individuals, and then a set of social entities, properties, and social processes. And from that, you can get various kinds of individualism that run roughly from atomism on one end to something that's barely individualism at all on the other end. So I think ABMs aren't really individualists in any of these formulations. And the basic reason is that the entities in ABMs are a placeholder. They quantify over individuals, but that doesn't decide the ontology. Numerous ABM models take social entities such as banks, firms, etc., as the basic entities, make no reference whatsoever to individuals. And even when ABMs have as their basic entities individual human beings, social entities show up frequently in the environment, which rules out stronger versions of individualism. So just to tie this back to the naturalist meta-ontological ideas, what ontology, any particular piece of social science is committed to, has to be argued for. It can't not be easily read off of what the quantifiers are. Frequently, the theory is loosely formulated and can be read in multiple ways. So it is essential to try to get clear on what the formulations of the theories are. This is a bit of my inner positivist emerging here. And I think there's absolutely no reason there must be the same ontology for all formulations, and certainly not for all social research. A second application, structural realism. I think I don't have to make large claims about what fundamental physics shows to find more local, empirical, structuralist, ontological claims about the social. There are lots of applications here. I have or two in this. One is just that the idea that there is social structure that explains and includes individuals just as occupiers of positions and structures. This is a bit like structuralism and mathematics, where a number is a role in a sequence. And if you take that view, then it's an empirical claim that individual traits matter less than the roles occupied. There are various ways to spell that out. I can talk about that. A nice example, I think, is thinking about the distribution of income. A structuralist approach would say you can't really think of that as just based on the traits of individuals. It's also the distribution of jobs, positions that matter. Asta's points in her gender talk nicely illustrated this. And I think there are many more other examples to explore. One is causal models, which frequently make qualitative claims where the quantitative value of the variables can differ across cases. So there's a qualitative causal structure, which is in a way independent of the value of the independent variables. Last application to race. I have another long paper on this. Here, I would think the question, is race real? Is a bit misguided. People use the concept of race for all kinds of things, all kinds of purposes. Sort of fascinating historical stuff is Brazil, where they basically power has for decades denied there is any such thing, when obviously there is clear racial discrimination. There is a body of literature saying that there's no such thing as race, just discrimination, basically. Both philosophers and social science have said this. I think this is too general to be really. Obviously, race is not a biological kind, or if it is, it's quite thin and so on. I think that, again, the sort of contextualist natural point is, does our best social science explain in terms of races? It's an empirical question whether that social science has to involve races or can only talk about the attitudes of individuals. I think at some times, some places, and I don't, this is another contextualist point, I don't think there's any right answer to what is race in abstract. But I think at some places and some times, races are real. Of course, they're socially constructed, but they are what I would call concrete individuals, cohesive wholes. And I think if you look at the US and South Africa, the evidence is pretty clear for that. So the moral of the paper is many social ontology issues are largely local, empirical ones. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Harold. So we have plenty of time actually for questions. And as usual, I think we're going to use the chat. Q for question, F for follow-up. All right, Raphael is the first one.
Yeah, I don't see Harold. I like to see him when I talk to him. Okay, I don't see you, Harold. So, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting, and I'm also a big fan of your work. I just wanted to ask you a question on your last case. So I was wondering what you would say about Nazi social science about involving race, whether you would say that in this case, races actually existed.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? I didn't quite follow.
So, because if I understood your claim, it was you said that to the general question of whether there is a race or not, whether a race that exists or not doesn't make sense as such. So you need to go from social science and to on a case by case basis to infer from from what science says to the existence or not of races. And I was wondering what you would say about the case of Nazi science, because there was a Nazi social science and biological science. So it was wrong, but in this case, you could infer from this science to the fact that races existed, maybe in the Nazi state. So this is an absurd consequence of what I understood from your talk. So maybe I didn't understand your point.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess to me, the obvious answer is Nazi social science about race was really bad social science. So, we have no reason to take it seriously. I mean, my claim that whether race exists is a social science question is presuming that we have good social science. And then we still have to interpret that. Oh, the Nazi stuff was silly. I guess that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Hendricks is the second in line.
Yeah, that's thanks for that. I am very sympathetic to most of what you said. Just have a clarificatory question about your claim that individualism holism debate is ultimately hinges on empirical questions. I wonder how that relates to what I think is also true of that debate, and that many people who contribute to it do it on the basis of a priori commitments. So some scientists might have very reductive commitments, thinking that good explanations are reductive explanations. And some others might suffer from a lack of imagination. They think, well, it must be the individuals because they are the only ones who act. And they infer from that individualism must be true. And that is probably fallacious reasoning. Neither of these seem to be empirical claims. So my question is, how does your claim that in the end it is an empirical matter relate to these other claims?
Yeah, okay, good question. I have to confess, I basically think these approaches are confused. To say only individuals act, okay, then tell a story about what it is to act. What does that require? I've written some stuff on this. It's you can take utility theory and as an account of acting, and you can use that to describe behavior under constraints, and then you can ask does that kind of theory help you understand collective agents? But I don't really think that anti-individual really requires you to commit yourself to collective agents. So those approaches for me are just to a priori or to armchair. So I want to ask the people who make such claims, show me some actual empirical research and how your ideas apply. I don't think that's impossible, but that's my general prejudice, I would say.
Thanks.
All right, Olivier Massin.
Yes, thanks a lot, Harold, for the talk. This is a clarificatory question about where exactly you still think there is a room for conceptual analysis in the view you propose. So I understand you think we shouldn't be doing too much of it, and you stress that we should take empirical sciences far more seriously, that we are now doing in social ontology. But where exactly are you granting that conceptual analysis is needed in your project? Can you give us some example of legitimate conceptual claims? I wasn't sure exactly where it stands in your picture.
Yeah, that's a good question. And, you know, I mean, there are a range of naturalist views here, from really tough philosophers have nothing to contribute to, you know, other more vague positions, which would, I guess, mine. You know, I mentioned, I think, the work on causality by philosophers. John Mackey's work has had a big influence in parts of the social sciences, and then of course Gleamore and others also. And I tried to say, I'm not sure I said it clearly, that look, social scientists for sure do conceptual analysis on their own all the time. And I think that's not unique to the social scientists. But, you know, my conclusion was, maybe this is too wishy-washy, was conceptual analysis in terms of trying to clarify what's going on, what's being claimed, is a used thing. What's not useful is if you try to go from some kind of conceptual analysis to strong empirical claim about how the world works. And then, you know, again, the wishy-washy part is, well, it's a matter of degree, and I'm uncomfortable with conceptual analysis the further it is from any concrete empirical social research.
Thanks, Aaron.
There's another question by Raphael.
I had another question. So was also a clarification question. So I was wondering, what is the relation between your method of inferring ontological claims from case-by-case analysis of scientific claims with the project in the natural ontology, when people try to distinguish real entities that are postulated by natural scientists from not real entities, using the numerical arguments, but on a case-by-case basis. So try to distinguish in a theory which are the idle wheels and which are the working wheels, and by using as a criterion the novel prediction success. So whether you could have it also in social science, or whether it also makes, whether it is also a part of your project or your method.
Yeah, nice question. I wish I knew the answer. Yeah, I think it's, I've been fascinated recently by looking at psychometrics and related sort of work in structural equation modeling. And so I mentioned, the problem with the Quine claim, quantifying over than it's real, is you still have to do all this interpreting afterwards. And the novel prediction idea is a good one. I'm still puzzled over things like talking about depression as an entity, I'm quite skeptical that there's something latent depression behind just the symptoms of low mood, etc. And so when should I take those things as real and it's just nice constructs? You know, I think the answer has to be something along the lines you're suggesting, in terms of what else can I predict with it, and what causes can I relate it to? But yeah, to be frank, I really don't know. I'm thinking about this, but I don't have a great answer. If anybody else does, I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I will ask a question then. Harold, I mean, one of the problems with for the naturalist is that science does not always give us a consistent picture of the world, precisely, you know, because as you say, you know, many claims that we find in scientific theories are local claims and not general claims. And so I wonder, you know, what is the job, or maybe is there a job, you know, for philosophers in trying to figure out how to make the claims that we find in scientific theories consistent. I mean, I guess this is one of the problems of, you know, the disunified picture of science, or, you know, the dappled world picture of science that has become, you know, fairly popular over the last 20 or 30 years. So yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, is there room for you know, philosophical work there? I mean, you know, within the sciences, but sort of, you know, across the models that the sciences give us.
Yeah, okay, yeah, good question. Yeah, my reaction is yes. It's just that it's kind of hard work. So, you know, to go beyond the social sciences and think about, you know, evolutionary biology. I mean, I think Sober and lots of others have done a lot of useful work in trying to show that various debates over group selection, you know, may be confused, and various claims may be compatible, although the biologists think, you know, they have strong, almost ideological views. And so this a good philosophical task is to try to go in and say, well, are you people really disagreeing, or how are you disagreeing? And perhaps we can clarify the debate. And I think that's great stuff. So, so yeah, I think philosophers can definitely contribute to trying to unify, clarify, explain what's complementary and what's not, etc. I'm all for that.
Question by Don.
Thanks, Harold. Good talk. Of course, I agreed with pretty much all of it, but just now in the question period, you said, well, if anybody has a response to the question about, you know, how we try to distinguish real, again, in some contextualist sense, of course, but real from unreal, you know, how do we do ontology? I mean, that's what that amounts to. And your example was depression. that is, you gave that as an example of where you're not clear how one would best approach the question. Now, I think you're right. I don't know either whether depression is a real phenomenon. But I don't think we have no idea how to think about the question. That's the point of the real patterns analysis that I've been pushing for 20 years. Right? Notice depression is exactly the right kind of case for which that sort of analysis is intended. When I wonder whether there is a thing, whether depression is a real thing or just an instrument, just a kind of instrumental pragmatic construct for cutting some corners, what it boils down to is, are there predictions and explanations and other patterns that I can get a handle on if and only if I have a concept, I use a concept of depression that is more than the simple conjunction of this phenomenon that generates depressive symptoms and this other phenomenon that generates depressive symptoms, and yet this other phenomenon that generates depressive symptoms. In other words, is this merely a portmanteau thing, depression, right? Yep. Or is there a real pattern there? I mean, I don't think that the analysis of real patterns that James and I have in our book is fully adequate. I think we made a mistake there in specifying real patternhood in terms of classical computational relations. But watch this space, because we're working on replacing that with a more properly statistical, it's still computational, but computational in sort of neural network statistics, Bayesian updating terms rather than programs. But the general idea of real patterns, Dennett's insight, I think is precisely what's supposed to answer that question. It looks to me like it's answering it in the right way, given the issues, given the examples that you used in your talk.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Great question. We should talk about this independently. I've been made a real pattern sort of idea. This is exactly where I would want to go. I think you'll agree that Dennett's real patterns are probably way too permissive, but yeah, I've actually been sitting around, I've got paper beside me with little causal diagrams, trying to think about how would I simulate data and try to use something like depression as a variable, and how could I tell? So I'm quite sympathetic to what you're saying. But I think, at least for me, I needed to really to look at concrete examples. Give me some data, let me see what I can do with it, etc. But I'm entirely for the direction that we're suggesting.
Thanks. Thank you.
So I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think we can probably close the session here and thank Harold again for his presentation. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
So, Raphael, do you want to say anything, or shall we just say that we're going to reconvene at 2?
Yeah, I want to say thank you to the speakers, and thank you to you, Francesco, for chairing this session.
Okay, well, see you all later, and have a good lunch.
See you later.